Now, let's talk about a system of pin escapes. Let's understand right from the start that there is an obvious and immediate limit on how much of a system we can honestly propose with regards to pin escapes. This is due to what we might call the specificity problem. Each specific pin in the sport of jiu-jitsu and each specific configuration of the various pins requires a different method of defense and escape. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes time to pin escapes. The most we can offer is a set of heuristic rules, guidelines, and body movements to get you out of pins. The onus will be on you to learn the specific pins, their strengths and weaknesses, and the specific responses to each problem that you are confronted with. This video is largely concerned with this. Remember, there is a key to every lock and a means to untie every knot, no matter how daunting this may seem at times. My goal in this video is to give you knowledge of the main pins in the sport of jiu-jitsu, also the main configurations within those pins, and show you the specific methods of getting out of each. Nonetheless, there is a set of general guidelines that we can give you, a kind of heuristic system of pin escapes based around the idea of, first, a general insight on the very nature of pins. Understand something right from the start. Pins are a set of wedges supported by body weight. So almost all the various escapes that we study will be based on the idea of off-balancing your opponent's body weight and getting inside the wedges they have set up around you. That's so important, I'm going to say it to you again. If we define pins as a set of wedges supported by body weight around your body, then the vast majority of escapes that we employ in the sport of jiu-jitsu will be based on the idea of off-balancing their body weight and then getting inside the wedges our opponent has constructed around us. A second element. There are two methods of escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu. There are reversal escapes, where we end up toppling our opponent over and we end up on top of them, and there are escapes back to guard. As you become more advanced, there is a third category of escapes where you stand up from bottom position and get away from your opponent, but at fundamental levels, these are not often seen. So we're going to focus on reversal escapes and guard escapes. Understand this. The vast majority of the escapes that you will be employing are escapes back to guard position. While reversal escapes do have their place, they pale in comparison with the number of times you will be using the guard position as the means of escape in the sport. Understand also that there are three core body movements involved in escape, more than all the others put together. Of course, there are many other forms of body movement. We'll be going through all of them, but more than any other, there are three basic body movements which I want you focusing on and mastering. These are bridging, shrimping, and back heisting. Don't worry, I'll explain what all three are in great detail as the video progresses. So we have a pin escape system, a general pin escape system. We understand it's going to be a heuristic system. It won't be a precise step-by-step because there is no one-size-fits-all guide to getting out of pins. These are scenarios where you need to understand the specific problem in front of you and give a specific solution to it. Nonetheless, I propose a simple 5-step heuristic system for getting out of pins, and let this be your general guide for action. Step number 1 is always to reduce your vulnerability and discomfort. Remember, you're getting pinned. Your opponent is in a dominant position from where they can go to attack you with various submission holds. And so your first thing is to reduce your vulnerability to those submissions. Secondly, many of these pins can be extremely uncomfortable, and it's hard for you to focus upon escapes if you can't even focus because of extreme bodily discomfort. So your first goal is always to reduce your vulnerability and to reduce the discomfort you might be feeling in the bottom of the pin. Don't worry, I'll be showing you how to do this. The second key element is to be able to create space between you and your opponent. Remember, the whole idea of a pin is to take away space between you and your opponent. So as the man being pinned, you want to be able to create space. The two most important body movements associated with this are bridging and shrimping. And we'll be spending a lot of time on mastering those two body movements and how they apply to pin escapes. The third critical element is going to be your first attempts to get inside your opponent's wedges and establish inside position with one of your limbs. Typically, this is done with an elbow. It doesn't have to be an elbow, but most of the time it is. Once we establish inside position, we get into the truly most important element of pin escapes in the sport of jiu-jitsu. This is the notion of majority inside control. Whenever someone goes to pin you, they must have majority inside control. More of their limbs must be inside your limbs than vice versa. Your goal is to reverse that, and by progressively getting your limbs more and more inside your opponent's limbs until you have more limbs of yours inside his limbs than he has inside you, you will be able to escape. You will be able to get back to guard position and complete the fifth and final step, which is, of course, to recover guard. So 5 steps in the pin escape system. Step number 1, reduce your vulnerability and discomfort. 2, create space. 3, establish your first set of inside position. 4, establish majority inside position. And 5, recover guard. That's a simple 5-step heuristic system. You will, of course, have to apply it differently in each case for different pins and different configurations of pins, but that's the core insight that I want you to begin with.
Let's take a big picture look at the notion of pin escapes. The first thing I want to introduce you to is a very obvious problem associated with getting out of pins. I often refer to this as the specificity problem. You will notice that there are many different ways to get pinned, and even within each separate pin, there are different ways your opponent can actually enact the pin. In other words, there are many variations of mounted position, side position, north-south. Each different pin and each different pin variation requires a precise form of escape relative to that specific scenario that you find yourself in. Imagine a situation where you have 5 padlocks in front of you and 5 keys, and you don't know which one is matched to which. Only a fool would expect one padlock key to open all 5 padlocks. Of course, the real skill would be in identifying which key is correlated with which padlock, and once you've done that, you could open all 5 padlocks without a problem. So too with pin escapes. There are different forms of pin and different variations within each one of those pins, and you must, in time, learn the appropriate way to unlock each one of those padlocks in front of you. For example, if I'm mounted on top of Sean Williams, I can hold myself in many different ways. I can go left crossface, right crossface. We can go hand inside the lapel. We can go 2 hands on the floor. I can have my knees low down by his belt. I can have a high mounted position. There are many, many different variations within the mounted position. Side position, even more so, and north-south too. And there's a requirement on our part to use the specific escape for the specific pin that we're in. Because there is such a large number of different variations within each pin, it can be tough to lay down a precise, systematic, step-by-step approach to getting out of all pins. The system that you would propose would be rather lengthy and difficult to remember under combat conditions. So what I'm going to propose to you is a checklist system. This is essentially a heuristic approach to systems, where we offer a set of guidelines, rules of thumb, etc., to guide your behavior. Because it's a heuristic system, giving broad guidelines rather than a step-by-step algorithmic system, it gives you the flexibility required to get out of a rapidly changing pin situation where your opponent is going from one type of pin to another or one variation of a pin to another. First, let's just have a look at the specificity problem in itself. Okay, let's say, for example, I was bottom side control, and Sean Williams was holding one form of pin. This one here, the top head and arm, where he's got my arm and head controlled by a crossface and an underhook, and his hands are locked. Okay, this is one problem for me to deal with. If Sean Williams took his right hand and started blocking my hip, that would create a different pin for me to get out of. Why? How does this work? Okay. Here, his right elbow is blocking my hip, and when the hands lock, he's created closed wedges around my body. This does an excellent job of controlling the movement of my head and shoulders. However, it doesn't do much to control the movement of my hips and legs, and as a result, it's not unheard of for me to get my legs inside quite easily in these situations. Okay? So Sean Williams might be cognizant of that and take his hand and create a defensive wedge right there in front of my legs and hips. Now, it can be very difficult for me to bring my knees inside as I just did. He could strengthen this by taking his arm over to a reverse crossface position. And now my head can't move in that direction. And you can see now that my attempts to put him back in guard may well stumble and fall. So now we might have to switch entirely to a different mode of escape, where my primary emphasis now is on getting hands inside that wedge down by the hips and working my way up to a position onto my knees. From here, it may not be difficult for us to go back into guard and begin working from a guard position like so. You can see what happened there. My training partner was in one version of a pin, and he switched to a second variation. And that required on my part a change in an approach to escape. Initially, the elbow escape would have been just fine, but then it was blocked, and I had to switch to another mode of escape. Because there's a very large number of pins and an even larger number of pin variations, that means you've got to cover a lot of ground. And the most important thing for you to develop is a mental skill, and that is the skill of identification. The single biggest ramification of the specificity problem is that it points the way towards mastery of pin escapes. We have to become masters of identifying what is the actual problem you are trying to overcome. And because it's a dynamic problem, a problem that can change as your opponent moves around you, you've got to keep up with changes in the problem. If he presents problem A at a given moment in time and then switches to a second problem B, you've got to keep up with that. That requires on your part as a developing student an ability to identify what pin am I being held in, and then correlate that with the appropriate escape. That skill of identification is going to be a huge part of your ability to get out of a punishing pin or a series of pins whenever you're underneath your opponent. I'm going to give you some rough guidelines now that will run throughout this instructional video. They will be illustrated in great detail as you go further and further into the video. But I want to give you an overview and a simple checklist system, a heuristic system, which will give you a general picture of what you're trying to accomplish when you get out of a bad position. Step number one on our checklist is always the same. Understand something. When you're in the bottom of the pin, you're vulnerable. Okay, you're not just down on points. You're in a position where you can be finished. You're in a position where your opponent can go to another form of pin and get more points against you. In other words, it's already a bad situation, and it's quite easy for things to get worse. So step number one is always going to be to reduce our vulnerability. In particular, you're going to reduce your vulnerability to submission holds, and you're going to reduce your vulnerability to your opponent scoring more points on you by going to another form of pin. So say, for example, we were bottom side control. Here, I am maximally vulnerable to my opponent because I have no defensive arms in place and my arms are in an outside position. Sean Williams owns all the inside real estate. His shoulder is inside my shoulder. His right arm is inside and underneath my left arm. His right knee is inside my hip. His head is inside my shoulder. And as a result, I have no inside position whatsoever. He could hold me here all night in this position.
Moreover, he would also find it very easy to go into submission holds using this underhook. He would also find it very easy to go to submission holds on the near side arm because my elbow is trapped up here, where he can easily sit into a variety of submission holds. So clearly, the first thing I need to do is to reduce my vulnerability to submissions. And that's all going to come by bringing everything inside. So our first step is going to be to take our elbow and bring the elbow inside, like so. Now we're going to reduce the vulnerability here by bringing our forearm inside and underneath our training partner's neck and jawline, or alternatively, punching through and getting inside and underneath here. Okay? You have now significantly reduced your vulnerability to your opponent's moves. Once again, if my arms start here in a rather hopeless looking situation, we have to start by reducing the vulnerability of the near arm by putting our forearm inside our training partner's hip. Then we have to bring our hand into a more sound defensive position, which denies an easy underhook control, or alternatively gives us our own underhook. And from here, we're significantly less vulnerable. Our elbows are much closer to our own body, and we have inside position. Even when Sean Williams locks his hands tightly here, his control is rendered insignificant by my arm position. So step number one is always going to be to reduce our vulnerability to submissions. There's a second sense in which we need to decrease our vulnerability in terms of him going to another pin. So for example, if Sean Williams pins me across side, it's quite easy for him to slide his knee across my stomach and score more points by going into the mounted position. Alternatively, he could bring his arm across, sit through, and step over into the mounted position. And this too would score him additional points. So it's important in these situations that we reduce our vulnerability by bringing our body into a posture that makes that more difficult. One is to take our knee and put it here at our training partner's hip and put my foot slightly higher than my own knee. Now when my training partner goes to slide his knee across the stomach, there's considerable resistance. It's also important that my elbow go inside my training partner's hip, so that even if I was deficient with my leg position, as he goes in to slide into the mount, I could easily come out the back door on the other side. Okay? So by putting my arms in inside position and blocking hips, we're greatly reducing our vulnerability to both submission holds and to pins. So step number one in our heuristic system of escape will always be reduce your vulnerability. Okay? Step number two is to decrease the amount of discomfort that you are in. Remember, when a pin is well applied, it's not a pleasant experience. Okay? Strong cross-face pressure and other mechanical tricks can make the bottom position a very uncomfortable one indeed. Whenever you're faced with solving a difficult problem, it helps a lot if you're feeling comfortable. Okay? Imagine trying to solve a complex piece of a complex mathematical problem, one which required pencil and paper for you to work your way through over time to get it to a solution. And the entire time you were trying to solve the problem, you were being electrocuted. Okay? It's already a difficult problem, now it's a lot more difficult to solve. Okay? Physical discomfort makes any kind of problem-solving activity more difficult. So anything that you can do to reduce the amount of physical pressure that you're under, the amount of physical discomfort, is money in the bank. Okay? So let's look at some common ideas involved here. Okay, cross-face pressure. Whenever you feel a punishing crossface coming in here, and you can hear my voice changing as Sean Williams goes into applying more and more pressure, we need to do something about that. Okay, so we're going to take our hand and we're going to overwrap our training partner's shoulder and lock it right in here. As Sean Williams goes in to apply pressure, we're going to start a bridging action and a turn that brings his shoulder off our jawline. Will you be able to hold this forever? Nope. However, you will now be able to start going into your various escape strategies. Okay? Another effective method of dealing with strong cross-face pressure. The crossface is going in this direction. I'm going to vector it over the other shoulder by taking my own bicep crossface. As Sean Williams goes to drive his crossface, we're going to misdirect his head
to the other side of our body. He can't apply a crossface unless his head is on one side of my head and his shoulder is on the other. When his head and shoulder are on the same side, there's no crossface. Okay? So we've got to reduce the discomfort that we're in. We start with a strong bridge and we move his head across. And now we can get legs inside, and now the crossface pressure has been reduced considerably. Okay? Other ways of reducing pressure. Sean Williams is going to put all his weight on my diaphragm, and you're going to hear my voice changing as that diaphragm pressure mounts. Okay, this is an uncomfortable thing. Right now it doesn't feel bad, but if we were engaged in a hard 10-minute match and I was already tired before he got this on, this is a bad situation now. My breathing's been interfered with. Okay, so how can I relieve this? We relieve it by getting off the flat of our back. As our opponent holds us in tight here, look how the simple action of turning onto my side creates a much better ability to bear my training partner's weight. Now there's a danger he's going to use a crossface to re-flatten me out and go back and work here. However, every time we turn onto our side, we get opportunities to bring legs back in. And have faith that when the legs start coming back in, it's significantly more difficult for him to start reapplying that pressure. Okay? So we always want to start with the idea of taking away crossface pressure and getting as much as possible onto our side. If someone's directly mounted on me, here, flat on my back, I feel all their weight, and you can hear it in my voice as he comes in, starts applying a strong crossface. I never want to turn into a crossface. I turn into it, it just makes things worse. Okay? So we always turn with the crossface, and we start to turn onto our side. We get frames inside, and now from here, even when he locks in tight with his feet, we have an ability to start bringing legs in. Okay, once we get legs in, then we can start the escape business and move out of it. So step number 2 is always going to be to take the small steps required to make whatever discomfort you're in manageable. Okay? Sometimes it might be something just as small as getting your breath back, taking 3 sharp, deep breaths into the pit of your lungs. And this too, a seemingly small step, can give you the wherewithal to actually go out and start planning an escape. It's difficult to plan an escape when you're in extreme discomfort. So step number 1, reduce your vulnerability. Step number 2, reduce whatever discomfort you're in as much as possible. It may still be uncomfortable, but just make it manageable. Okay? Now, this brings us on to the third and arguably the most important step. This is the one I want you guys focusing on a lot as you go to watch the rest of this video. This is the step of identifying the problem. There's nothing more sad in the sport of jiu-jitsu of watching people work really, really hard in the wrong direction. Okay? Imagine you were given the task of digging up some valuable piece of merchandise that had been buried in the earth, and someone gave you a treasure map which was just 100% wrong. And you went out and you spent 5 days digging a massive trench and you found nothing. Okay? Then someone gave you the correct map, you went over, you did some digging, and you quickly found the treasure. There would be something sad about that story, that there was 5 days of wasted effort that could have been alleviated just by getting the correct treasure map from the start. So too with pin escapes. All the time I see people in a pin applying an escape which is clearly not appropriate for the very pin that they're in, doing hard work, getting tired, frustrated, and exhausted, and then nothing to show for it. So it's absolutely critical that we develop the skill of identifying what we're doing here. What are we in? What is the problem in front of us? How are we going to solve the problem? So when someone gets on top of us, our first thing here is always to reduce our vulnerability. That always comes from bringing our limbs inside to the greatest degree possible. Then we want to minimize the discomfort that we're in. We might still be uncomfortable, but we want to minimize it. So we play games with the crossface, we bring our body in close, we turn onto our side, etc. Now I want to start to identify, how is my opponent holding me? In particular, where are the wedges they're using to control me? Okay. Here, my opponent has opted for what is arguably the most popular form of side control, pin, where he's got a crossface and an underhook, and he's closed the wedges by locking his hands. So in other words, all of his wedging force is placed around my head and shoulders, but that provides ample opportunity for the lower body to move. Okay? My opponent can change that by taking his hand down here to the hip. Now he has a wedge on the far side and a wedge on the near side. So now he has a good ability to wedge my head in one direction, but not the other. And he has a great ability to stop my knee from going in like so. So instead of my leg going in, which is easily stopped by my training partner, I now identify the new problem. The problem is now changed, and I need a new solution. The basis of the solution is always the same. I want to get inside my training partner's wedges, but he's got different wedges now. So instead of bringing a knee inside, which is proving to be impossible against this grip, you bring a hand inside. And I still work with the principle of inside control, it's just that I'm using it in a different fashion. Instead of a leg going inside, it's an arm. And as a result, we can come up and into a good attacking position. So you can see the pattern that's starting to emerge here. Ultimately, the solution is always the same. Get your limbs inside your opponent's limbs. His limbs are wedges around your body, and you want to get inside his wedges. The question will always be, how are you going to do that? And that will change depending upon how your opponent is holding you. Sometimes it will be your legs. Sometimes it will be your arms. Which one you choose is something that I will be showing you in the course of this video. But initially, at least, looking at the big picture, I want you guys starting with these first 3 critical steps. Step number 1, reduce your vulnerability. Step number 2, reduce your physical discomfort to the greatest degree possible. You might still be uncomfortable, but try your best. Step number 3, identify the problem. Where are the wedges and how are you going to get inside them? Will it be with your arms? Will it be with your legs? Now, it's time to get into step number 4. This is the idea of moving our opponent's body weight. Understand what a pin really is. A pin, lie down, Sean, is a set of wedges reinforced by body weight. Okay? So here I have one wedge underneath my training partner's body. Here I have a second wedge underneath my training partner's body, and I've reinforced those wedges with my body weight. And as a result, we have a tight pin across our training partner's side. Okay? So you can see the sense in which any pin is always the same thing. Okay? All the major pins of jiu-jitsu, other than knee on belly, are essentially the same story. It's a set of wedges positioned around the body, reinforced by body weight. So our goal is to first get inside his wedges, and then secondly, start moving the body weight that reinforces those wedges. So, if we had 4 legs on top of us, pinning us down, and we have managed to get to some degree inside those wedges. Now the next thing is to start moving his body weight. And that will come from 2 major body movements. There are others, and we'll be looking at them in the video, but the 2 big ones that I want you spending most of your time on are bridging and shrimping. And don't worry, we'll be going into a lot of detail on bridging and shrimping in this video. But initially, at least, we want to focus on the idea of a bridge that moves our opponent's body weight significantly, so that his center of gravity is no longer in a position to reinforce the wedges. And as a result, we can start bringing our body further and further inside his wedges and establish more and more inside control, so that from here we can start going into strong counter offense and getting people moving from on top of us. So once again, we've identified where the wedges are. In this case, they're around my head and shoulders. Okay? So we want to be able to get inside, and then from here, start moving body weight. One classic way is a bridging method. This bridge gets his body weight off, his center of gravity off my center of gravity, in a way which greatly facilitates getting inside our training partner's body. That from here, it won't be a difficult thing for us to play with the notion of inside control. Please note that sometimes you will have to move your opponent's body weight first to generate kazushi, as we say, and then get inside. Most of the time you get inside control first, then you move the body weight. Sometimes the order switches, okay? And you have to be alive to that. You have to be sensitive to this. So the order of these can switch depending on the situation. Typically, it's something inside first, then move the body weight. Sometimes just to get inside, you've got to move his body weight. You've got to bridge and shrink. Okay. The basic body movements that are involved here, I'll just demonstrate this by myself. The idea of bridging. The key element is we never want to bridge straight up and come straight back down. We always want what we call single shoulder bridges, where we move an opponent's body weight and we go onto one shoulder and a knee on the floor. So that instead of moving our opponent's body straight up to the ceiling, where it just comes right back down once we come back down to the floor, we want to move him off us rather than up and down on top of us. The key is asymmetrical bridging, where instead of bridging with two symmetrical legs straight up, one leg moves out. And as a result, we're in a position to take his body weight out here off us so that we can start getting frames inside and putting people back in guard, getting up to our knees, etc., etc. The other key element is the idea of shrimping. Now, shrimping is a movement done in most jiu-jitsu schools every day when the class starts. And typically it's done as a kind of a lackadaisical exercise, sliding up and down the mats. You guys have to go better than that. Okay, there are three main forms of shrimping that we use. There are others, but the three big ones that I want you to focus on, we'll spend most of our time in this video, involve the idea of, first, a power shrimp, which moves my opponent's body weight. Okay, where we take our opponent's body and we move with the same motion we saw in a bridge, and then we add a shrimping movement that enables us to bring knee and elbow together. The next is a sliding shrimp. We can practice sliding along the mat. We need to bring our hips up to our shoulder line. So my feet come to the outside to maximize the distance that I cover, and then from here we shrimp all the way out of my body jackknives so that my elbows, hands, and head are very close together. And then from here we can slide out from side to side to finish escapes. Okay? The third form of shrimp is a reverse shrimp, where instead of pushing off the floor, we turn away from an opponent, fix on the floor, and pull ourselves towards a foot. So instead of pushing away from our feet, like so, a classical shrimp, we go through and we pull like a hamstring curl. And this too can be a very useful thing. So for example, if I'm being pinned across side, we bring the camera over here, we can turn our body away from our opponent and pull so we can get slipping out the back door. Then we can throw legs inside, start turning on opponents, and we end up in good attacking position, ready to counter attack. So these three variations of shrimping are very important. We'll be covering them in a lot of detail in this video as we progress further on. Between bridging and shrimping, this will constitute about 90% of the physical movements that will generate kazushi, off balancing in your opponent, and get that weight that reinforces the wedges off you. Once you start moving that body weight, it becomes a lot easier to go into the next step in our sequence. So we started with the idea of, first, let's reduce our vulnerability. Second, let's reduce our discomfort so we can think clearly. Step number 3 was to identify the precise problem in front of us. Don't just move for the sake of moving. Identify the problem and correlate right back with the appropriate body movement. Then we had to generate some kind of kazushi or off balancing to get our opponent's body moving so we could start getting more and more of our body inside. This brings us to arguably the most important element of all pin escapes, and the one I want you guys spending a lot of time training. This is the idea of majority inside control. When you first go in to get your limbs inside your opponent, typically it's your elbow and forearm. It's one limb, okay? Your forearm inside his hip. So for example, I'm being pinned across side. Typically, the first movement is to get here, my elbow inside. So that for every inch that I move away from Sean Williams, when he tries to follow me, there's something stopping him. If I didn't have that, and I moved away from him, he would just follow me effortlessly, okay? what we need to do is we need to create situations where you're moving away from him at a greater rate than he can follow you. And that's what these frames are for. Okay? So every time we go to move away, he finds it difficult to follow. And as a result, space develops between us, and now we have a good chance of putting it back in guard. Okay? That's the basic idea we work with. Similar things happen when someone is mounted on us. We always want to get a forearm and elbow inside. So when he tries to come up into a high mount, he can't. Okay? And when I move away from him, I can start to create space into which the various forms of escape can start to occur. Okay? So there's always that desire to get our first limb inside. It's almost always an elbow and forearm. Okay? But we've got to go more than that. Ultimately, you're not going to escape and be effective from bottom until you have more of your limbs inside his than he has inside of you. Let's look at this mathematically. Sean Williams starts off with side control. Okay? How many items of inside control does he have? Well, he's got his head. His head is inside my shoulders. He's got his right arm. It's inside and underneath my arm is an underhook. He's got his shoulder, his left shoulder, inside my right shoulder. He's got his left knee inside my elbow. Come in close and block it out, Sean. So my arm is locked out in the cold here. He's got his right knee inside my hip. So he owns literally all of the inside real estate. He's got head inside, underhook inside, shoulder inside, left knee inside, right knee inside. What do I have inside? Zero, nothing. Okay, this is a losing situation. Sean Williams could hold me here all night. If I stayed here with my hands locked, he could literally hold me here until tomorrow. There's nothing I could do to get out. In addition, he could go into a vast number of submission holds. Okay? So our whole thing is to start by getting one element inside. 9 times out of 10, it's an elbow and a forearm. It doesn't look like much, but it's a foot in the door, and that's what you need. Okay? Now, once we get one thing inside, it's a process of moving his body weight and progressively getting more and more of your body inside. So now I take my knee and I put it inside Sean Williams' knee. So now I've got 2 items of inside position. Okay, I had 0, now I've got 2. My elbow is inside and my right knee is inside. Okay? I move my head away, hold tight. I move my head away and I take my hand and I bring my hand inside his bicep. Now I have 3 items of inside position. I have an inside tie with my right hand. My right knee is inside. Now, we need to move on from here. I take my left foot and I put my left foot in as a butterfly hook. So now we have 4 items of inside position. As we correct our body, I come through and I take an underhook. Now, I have more limbs inside Sean Williams than he has inside of me. And as a result, even though I'm underneath Sean, I'm still bearing his body weight to some degree. Sean, put all your weight on me. Because I have all the inside real estate, it's very easy for me to start generating effective motion from underneath. Do you see what's going on here? This cuts to the quick of what you'll be learning in this video. Everything we do is the attempt to first reduce our vulnerability and our discomfort. Then to identify the problem in front of us, and then to progressively work to own the inside real estate. It starts as a process. It starts with one item of inside real estate, usually the elbow and forearm. Okay, there are some exceptions to that, but that's by far and away the most common one. And then we must work progressively to get more and more inside real estate. This will involve body movements, usually bridging and shrimping on your part. It will involve getting more and more of your knees, feet, hands, elbows, etc. inside your opponents until a critical point is reached where you have more limbs inside your opponent than he is inside of you. Once you get majority inside control, you can start to move offensively and effectively from bottom position. He will no longer be able to use body weight and wedges to control you. You now own all the inside real estate. His wedges are now shut out, and his body will no longer hold you in place. Let's have a look at this in another context. This time, bottom mounted position. Okay, Sean Williams has his head inside my shoulder, his shoulder inside my shoulder, his feet locked in, and from here, I don't have any items of inside control, zero. Okay? So we bring a hand, and we bring it inside and underneath. So at least I have an elbow inside his hip now. Now I take an elbow, and I put it inside his knee. So I've got two items of inside position. Now we need to disturb his body weight and create Kazushi. That's where the single shoulder bridge comes in. Now I bring my knee inside his knee. Now we have three items of inside position. How many does Sean Williams have? All he's got is head position. I'm winning 3-1. And as a result, it's very easy for me to start moving his body weight. Now I put an elbow inside the other knee. I put a hand inside the bicep. And even though I'm underneath Sean Williams, I own almost all of the inside real estate. The only inside position he has is this arm. And it's becoming a liability to him at this point because I have so much of the other inside real estate. So that as we come around the corner, you will soon see from here, your escapes start leading directly into counter offense. So this is another example of gaining majority inside control over time. Understand something. You don't just get majority inside control. It's a process. It begins and is taken in increments. It starts with one, a foot in the door, and then you work over time, gaining quickly, smoothly, more and more of the inside real estate until a critical moment is reached where you're in control. You're still underneath, but it doesn't matter. What enabled him to control me in the first place were wedges supported by body weight. Now you've taken away almost all of his wedges, and you're moving his body weight easily as a result. And now, for the first time, the magic can start to happen. You can start working effectively from underneath someone's body weight and moving them in the directions you want on towards victory. And that is the basis of the escape system that I want you to focus on. This progression from extreme vulnerability on your part to extreme vulnerability on his part. Okay? It's a process that goes on in the fashion I just described. This entire video will be built around the very notions that I just talked to you about. Of step number 1, reducing your vulnerability. Step number 2, reducing your discomfort so you can think clearly. Step number 3, clearly identifying the problem in front of you and correlating that with a specific solution. Be aware that the problem can change. Your opponent can go from one pin to another, and that can happen quickly. So your mind has to be alert to this. Okay? In this video, we'll be showing you the various forms of pin that you could be held down by, the variations, etc., and how you can react to each one. But that will require some memorization on your part. Then the battle for inside control. It starts typically with just one limb. 9 times out of 10, it's an elbow and forearm. There are some exceptions, but 9 times out of 10, that's true. Then it's about that magical progression from one element of inside control to as many as possible. And as you finally get to a point where you own more inside real estate than he does, that's when you can go from being ineffective in bottom position to highly effective in bottom position. And you can start beating people. You can start winning matches from there. That, how would you say, a checklist or a heuristic system of escapes is what this video will be about.
Let's talk about the notion of defense and escapes in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu really is a sport with two faces. It has an offensive face and a defensive face. And anyone who wishes to gain expertise in the sport must be very strong in both. Of course, it's natural to have a bias towards one or the other, but anyone who has non-existent skills in one or the other definitely won't go very far in this sport. There are two faces to escape in jiu-jitsu as well. There are escapes to submission holds, and there are escapes to pins or hold downs. Let's have a look at a situation where I'm in my training partner's guard, for example. A basic form of submission here is jujigatame, the armbar. if my opponent goes into an offense, one kind of escape that we're expected to work against will be against submission holds. So here's a classic submission hold. I get swept down to the floor, and from this position, we go into a standard form of escape. My opponent switches to an omoplata, and from here, we go into another form of escape. And so there's a sense in which I perform 2 escapes in a fairly short time frame. That's one of the various mode of escape that we have to be able to perform in jiu-jitsu, escape to submission holds. But in truth, in a fundamentals program, most of our time will be invested not in escapes to submission holds, but in escapes to pins. The experience of most beginners in the sport of jiu-jitsu is pretty much the same. You come into class dreaming of arm bars, strangleholds, etc., but the reality is you're going to be held down on pins for most of your early time in jiu-jitsu, and this can be an enormously frustrating thing. Pins have a very different element. It's no longer one of my limbs which is being attacked. Okay, when I go to defend a submission hold, it's a defense of my limbs. But when we get pinned, it's a defense of my torso and my ability to move underneath an opponent. We'll be spending a huge amount of time on defense. As I said earlier, the experience of most beginners is one of frustration, of being held down helplessly and unable to move. It's the worst feeling, and it's probably responsible for more people quitting the sport of jiu-jitsu than all the other factors put together. If you can't get over this early experience in your development of being held down helplessly and unable to move, you won't stay long in the sport. It is absolutely critical that we develop a capacity to get away from pins and get back to generate movement underneath our training partner. So even though there are 2 modes of escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu, escape from submissions on the one hand and escape from pins on the other, most of our time will be spent on escapes from pins, because that will be where you spend most of your time as a beginning athlete in the sport of jiu-jitsu. I want to say something to you, my viewers, about the nature of escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Your long-term goal as an athlete in this sport is to become a highly offensive player who can attack his opponent at will, to engage in exciting, risk-taking jiu-jitsu, where you actively go after your opponent and try to get positive victories through the use of submission holds and attack. The only path that gets you to that goal is through a strong defense. I'll explain why. Any form of offense in combat sports, including jiu-jitsu, involves a large amount of risk. Let's say, for example, I'm in the mounted position on top of my opponent. If I attempt an armbar from there and the move should fail, I end up in a position underneath my opponent in most circumstances. I took a risk and I ended up in a position underneath my opponent. If I don't have confidence in my ability to work effectively out of bad situations, I won't take risks. Let's say, for example, I have a very strong armbar from guard, but I have very weak guard retention, and it's fairly easy for my opponent to pass my guard and get into a punishing pin across my side, and I feel my escapes are also just as weak as my guard retention, so that if he does pin me, I won't be able to get out and get back into offense. How hard do you think I'm going to go for that armbar of mine? I won't. I'll just hold on to a closed guard and hope that my opponent doesn't pass. Your capacity to go out and boldly attack your opponent is directly correlated to your confidence in your defense. I'll say this again. If you don't have confidence in your defense, you won't have confidence in your offense. You might have the moves, you might be capable of performing them, but when the time comes to pull the trigger in a competitive situation, you won't pull the trigger because you're afraid, knowing that ultimately your defense is weak, and if the risk doesn't pan out the way you wanted, you won't be able to move. And so you'll hold back, you'll shy away from risk, and you'll never become the jiu-jitsu player you want to be. Remember, your long-term goal is to become a good, positive, offensive jiu-jitsu player who can attack at will. But if you never develop the confidence in your defense, you'll never pull the trigger on that offense you try to build. And so the only path to the offensive spirit in jiu-jitsu is through defensive skill. That's why every time I teach beginners, everything begins with defense. My long-term goal is to create great attacking athletes. And if you look at my advanced students, that's exactly what they are. But you better believe when they first began, everything was defensive training. I'm going to give you your first goal in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Your long-term goal, as we said, is to become an offensively strong player who can play good, positive, attacking jiu-jitsu. But your first goal along the long-term path to that final goal is this. I want you to become unpinnable amongst your peers. That's your first goal. If you truly believe you can't be pinned, no one can ever hold you down in a position of disadvantage. Whatever offense you have, you'll use it. You'll take risks because you always feel at the end of the day, if the risk doesn't go in your favor, you can always get out and you can start again. But if you don't believe that, if you feel every pin is final and you'll never get away from a pin once you're in it, you'll never pull triggers in your offensive skills. And so your first goal as a beginning athlete in the sport of jiu-jitsu is always to become unpinnable amongst your peers. When I say your peers, I mean people in your class of similar belt level and similar size. It's unrealistic to expect you in your opening years in jiu-jitsu to become unpinnable by a world champion black belt. However, among your peers, take pride in your defense. I want you, after some period of time, to become unpinnable amongst your peers. That's your first goal. Let's talk about the notion of escaping from a pin in jiu-jitsu. Before I begin, let's quickly ascertain what is a pin in jiu-jitsu, because it's a little different than most combat sports. If we have a training partner lying down on his back facing me, legs up. In the sport of jiu-jitsu, no top position is considered a pin until I pass my training partner's legs. So, for example, my opponent is currently on his back. Okay, if we were engaged in the sport of wrestling, my opponent would be losing the fight rapidly at this point. In fact, the fight may even be over already if under certain rule sets. However, this scores nothing in the sport of jiu-jitsu. It's neutral. And some combat sports this is true too, and judo too. So nothing is going to happen in terms of pins until we start to clear our training partner's legs. Okay. From any situation where I form angle on my training partner and start to clear out my training partner's legs, and we get across our opponent's side into a chest-to-chest position, whether I be side, whether I be knee on belly, or whether I be mounted, or north-south, or any other variation. One thing they all have in common is I cleared my training partner's legs. Once you clear the barrier of your training partner's legs, pinning starts to happen. And typically there has to be some kind of hip-to-hip or chest-to-chest contact to solidify it, or at the very minimum, knee on stomach, etc., etc. But what these all have in common is the idea that I cleared my training partner's legs. Now, that's what differentiates jiu-jitsu pins from, say, wrestling pins. But what about, say, for example, the sport of judo or sambo, where you can clear your opponent's legs, and aren't their pins exactly the same as ours? Well, they're similar, because in judo also you have to clear your opponent's legs before something counts as a pin. But there's one other very significant difference between jiu-jitsu and other combat sports. If we have someone in a turtle position, like so, let's come back this way. From a situation like this, if I'm able to get two of my legs around and over my training partner's torso, this scores points, actually the maximum points. In the sport of wrestling and the sport of judo, this scores 0 points. This is a significant difference between jiu-jitsu and other jacketed forms of grappling thinking. Jiu-jitsu is almost alone among the various combat sports insofar as it allows chest to back pins. You can score points being behind people. In the sport of wrestling, throwing legs into your opponent's hips, it's a good thing, there's things you can do out of it, but it doesn't score anything, not until you put your opponent's back on the floor. In judo too, if you put hooks in on your opponent, it scores nothing. You can do good things from there, you can strangle them, you can do other things, but you're not going to score points with it. Jiu-Jitsu is unique in its approach to pinning in several important ways. The first is not unique, but it's an important part of it, is the idea that you must always clear your opponent's legs and have their back on the floor before you begin to be counted as pinning your opponent. Being inside your legs counts for nothing. At the same time, it's the only combat sport that I'm aware of which rewards people for chest to back pins. Provided I get my hooks in on my opponent's legs, I can score points. You won't see that in judo, you won't see that in wrestling. So our understanding of pinning can be explained very clearly right from the start. We've got to do several things. We've got to either clear our opponent's legs and get some kind of physical contact with his upper body, knee on belly, chest to chest, hips over hips, etc., etc. Or alternatively, we've got to get two hooks in from behind our opponent. If we can do those things, you're pinning your opponent and you're scoring points, you're winning the match. So you see, Jiu-Jitsu has a very different approach to pinning from other combat sports. Understanding that approach is a big part of what will motivate the way in which we teach our escape series later on in this video. Let's understand something right from the start. In Jiu-Jitsu, escape is your responsibility. You don't get rewarded for it. There are many grappling styles where an escape is rewarded with points. You get out of a bad situation, you get rewarded. Not so in Jiu-Jitsu. You're simply expected to get out of bad positions. The onus is on you. That is a part of the sport I've always admired. The assumption here is that escape and defense is so fundamental to the sport that it's something you just damn well take for granted. You don't get a reward. The same way in athletic competition, you don't get rewarded for showing up. You get rewarded for winning. So too in Jiu-Jitsu, you don't get rewarded for escape. That's just straightforwardly expected from you. It's such a foundational skill. It's taken for granted. That mindset I've always admired, and that must be your mindset too. You must be strong and proud of your escapes. Don't see it as something you've done which it's a good thing. Rather, it's something which is expected of you. Have that mindset and you'll go a long way with your escapes. Now let's understand something. There are three modes of escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Let's say, for example, I'm in turtle position and my training partner is behind me. One mode of escape in these kinds of situations might be an escape to a neutral position. Okay, so for example, if I stood up on my training partner in situations like this and turned and faced him in a neutral situation, I've escaped from a given position of disadvantage. My opponent was on my back and I stood up and I got back to neutral. So that would be one form of escape. A second form of escape might occur where we get what we call a complete reversal. Okay, say for example, bottom mounted position, my opponent's mounted, and however we've contrived it, we've trapped our training partner's sleeve on one side, foot on the other, and then from here we hit a complete reversal and we switch from top position to bottom, from bottom position to top position. This act of going from bottom to top is a form of reversal and counts as an escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. So far we've got two forms of escape, two modes of escape. The first might be an escape from a position of disadvantage back up to a neutral standing situation, or even neutral down on the knees. As long as there's a break of contact between the two athletes, it would count as an escape. The second would be some kind of complete reversal. We could do it from bottom mount position, as we just saw. It might even be from side control situations where someone had arms in place like so. If I push into my training partner and I feel him pushing back, under these circumstances, this too would count as a form of escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Anything where we go from bottom position to top would count as some kind of a significant escape. So those are two modes of escape. However, there is a third mode of escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, which is by far and away the most important. It will be by a landslide the dominant form of escape that we will look at in this video series, and it will be the one which will be with you from white belt to black belt as you make your journey down the jiu-jitsu road. And this is the form of escape where I put my opponent back into my guard. This is uncommon amongst most grappling sports. Okay, most grappling sports you cannot escape to your back. You can't just put your back on the ground and call that an escape. Only a few grappling arts would count this as an escape at all. Jiu-jitsu is definitely one of them. The overwhelming majority of escapes in the sport of jiu-jitsu are escapes back to the guard position. We're defining guard as any situation where my legs entangle my opponent's body. Okay, I could entangle his legs, I could entangle his waist, I can entangle his arms, etc., etc. If my legs, even a part of my legs, is between myself, my upper body and my opponent's upper body, you've got him in some kind of guard, and that would count as an escape. Okay, so say for example, if I'm being pinned across side, like this. In situations like this, if I'm able to create some kind of distance between myself and my opponent and bring my legs back between he and I, from a situation like this, we've now successfully escaped. Why? Because we brought our legs back as a barrier between my upper body and his upper body. As long as my legs are that barrier between his torso and my torso, you have your opponent in guard, everything is fine. It doesn't matter if your back is flat on the ground or what have you. This third mode of escape, the use of your legs as a barrier between his upper body and yours, the so-called guard position and the many variations of guard position, is by far the most dominant form of escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu. It is the one you will have to invest most of your time in and most of your study. And it is the one which I will spend the overwhelming majority of our time teaching escapes in this mode. So even though there are 3 modes of escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu, as a beginner, the best investment you can make is to invest most of your time in the skill of getting your legs back between you and your opponent and working to escape to guard position. Now, I want to start you off with a very important consideration, which I've never actually seen taught, but I'm going to make this a big theme of our video. You hear me talking about this so much, you'll get sick of it, I'm sure. This is the distinction between a minimal escape and a positive escape. Everything I'm going to do in this video is going to be to push you towards what I call positive escapes and to shy away from the idea of minimal escapes. What do I mean by this? Well, we've already defined the idea of what constitutes an escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu. The most common form of escape by far is some kind of leg entanglement, where I take my legs and somehow get them between me and my opponent's upper body. Now this can be done to greater or lesser degrees. This is a very important insight. Sometimes you can just catch an opponent with a foot and technically you've escaped. Okay, so for example, let's say I'm being pinned across side by Matthias, and let's say that in the heat of the moment, I kind of bring a leg in and I bring a foot over and I've kind of got Matthias back in a sort of half guard. It's kind of there. But at the same time, Matthias is bearing down on me and his foot is almost coming out. He's fighting to free his foot. And I've got a minimal control. I'm just down here on a foot. Technically, I have escaped. I did put him back in some kind of guard. My legs have entangled his legs to some degree. And technically, I did get out of a pin, okay? I got out technically, but realistically, do you think I could attack my opponent from there? Do you think I've done something positive? Do you think I've done something where Matthias feels threatened by what I've done? Absolutely not. I've just done the minimum requirement to get out of a pin. That's okay. It's not wrong what you've done, but it's not really desirable. Everything you want to do with your pin escapes is to go to a positive form of escape, where at the completion of the escape, you are in a position to attack your opponent from bottom position. That's what I call a positive escape. If you escape in a way where at the completion of the escape, you're ready to attack, you've done something positive. You're playing a positive game. And a positive game is one where I can take the fight to the opponent, where you can display an offensive spirit. I want to build in you a sense where you see defense as a precursor to offense rather than just a means of getting out. Okay, minimalist thinkers just think about just doing the minimum work required to get out of a pin. Okay, that's not the long-term development you want to work on. Every time you get out of a pin, you want to be able to renew the attack. So a positive escape example might be something like this. My opponent has me in place, and from here we shift our body out and we line up with our training partner's body and we get a good grip and we move our opponent's body. From here, I have a positive grip on my training partner. Okay, if he goes to pull away from me, it won't be easy. If he goes to yank his arm away from me, it won't be easy. And from here, there's a host of various forms of offense which I could engage in. So I didn't just escape from Mateus's side pin. I escaped and I put myself in a position where I could control my opponent's movement in directions that lead towards submission. In other words, at the completion of the escape, I can play a positive game of offense. That's the goal that you want. Don't be satisfied with just doing the minimum required to get tangled up with your opponent's body. That's a losing gambit in the long run. Okay, you'll never develop a sense of offense and the spirit of offense, which is the signature of good attacking jiu-jitsu. The idea is I want you to become defensively strong so that in the long run you can become offensively strong. And that means there must be a drive towards positive escapes. Don't just be satisfied with hooking your legs into your opponent and holding on for dear life. That's not the idea. The idea is to get out of a bad position and to put yourself in a situation where you can play a positive attacking game and control your opponent's body movement with offense from bottom. That's positive escapes. That's the direction I want you going in this video. Let's understand something. Pinning in jiu-jitsu has two distinct faces. The first is a tactical face, which we've seen a little bit of already. And the second is its physical manifestation. Okay? If we have an opponent down on his back, from any situation where my opponent works like so, the tactical element of pinning is I've got to get past my opponent's legs and get some kind of contact with his torso, either with my knee, my chest, or my hips. Okay, so once again, pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu, the tactical element is I've got to begin by getting past my opponent's legs. That never really changes. Okay, so for example, if I'm working with my training partner like so, here we look at a simple method of getting past our opponent's legs. Okay, once we get past our opponent's legs, then we have several directions we can go. We can go chest to chest situation where I can finish with a knee on my training partner's stomach. I can finish with my chest on his chest, or with my hips over his hips. There is, of course, the other option, that off the guard pass, my opponent may well end up exposing his back to me. And from here, if we get hooks in, from here, we're ready to pin chest to back. So, tactically, pinning in jiu-jitsu is easy conceptually to understand. First, get past your legs. Once you get past your opponent's legs, then it's about getting some kind of contact with your opponent's torso. There are chest-to-chest versions. These would be knee on stomach, chest on chest, or hips over hips. And there are chest on back versions where my chest touches my training partner's back and my two hooks go in. So that's our tactical understanding of pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu. But now we need to go further. Now we need to look at the physical side of pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu. And this is a topic that I want you to understand on a very deep level. Whenever you say to someone, what is the mechanical basis of pinning? They'll always tell you the same thing. Body weight. You're on top of the guy. Well, there's some problems with that. First, you're sitting in front of the tennis. In jiu-jitsu, this would be considered a pin. It's actually one of the highest scoring pin, along with the mounted position. And yet, is my body weight on top of Mateus? Of course not. His body weight is actually on top of mine. And yet, this counts as the highest scoring pin. So clearly, there's something of an issue here. It's not just about who's on top and whose body weight is on top. Many of the pins do involve body weight. But let's perform an interesting experiment. Matthias, you're going to lie down on your back. I'm going to put a huge percentage of my body weight on Matthias by going chest to chest and taking my knees off the ground, so that a very significant percentage of my body weight is on top of him. So here I am, chest to chest, like so. My knees are off the mat, so Matthias is feeling quite a bit of my body weight. With my hands behind my back, Matthias, just go to put me back in guard. It's ridiculously easy. I had a huge percentage of my body weight on top of him, and yet he blasted out in a matter of seconds, and it was extremely easy for him to do so. Why was it so easy for him? Because I didn't have any wedges around his body. There was nothing stopping his body weight from moving. My body weight didn't stop his from moving. Now let's contrast that with a different experiment. This time I'm going to put no body weight on Matthias, but I'm going to put a wedge over his far hip, a wedge with my knee at his near hip, and a wedge here at the bicep, at his neck. I currently have no contact with my chest with Matthias's chest. When he goes to move, it's very difficult for him. Isn't that odd? In the case where I had a very high percentage of my body weight on my opponent, he got out very easily. In the case where I had 0% of my body weight on him, he struggled to get out. What was the difference? In one case, there were no wedges, and in the other case, there were wedges. The basis of pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu is not body weight. It's wedging. It's my ability to create wedges around the most important parts of my opponent's body when it comes to generating movement from bottom. And those most important parts are his hips and his head. When the hips and the head can move, and just do some shrimping Matthias, when the hips and head can move, your opponent can escape. It doesn't matter how much body weight I put on Matthias. His hips are moving. It's so easy for him to put me back in guard. Body weight is not the most important part of pinning. Wedging is the centerpiece of pinning. The function of body weight in pinning is simply to reinforce the wedges. That's all it does. You don't have to put so much weight on your opponent as you have to construct strong wedges around your opponent's hips and head, and then reinforce them with whatever body weight you have. That's why small people can often pin much bigger people. So, if I'm on top of my training partner and I form a strong wedge at my training partner's hip and reinforce it on the other side with my knee, and then this strong wedge going underneath the lat muscle. As Matthias goes to move in a situation like this, he feels for the first time it's going to be a struggle to put me back in guard. Why? Because the two parts of his body that need to move, the head and the hips, are being wedged in place. The function of my body weight here is just to reinforce the wedges. So as Matthias goes for his escapes, my body weight simply reinforces the wedges. Remember, the primary element of your pins are the wedges you construct around your opponent's head and hips, and you reinforce those with whatever body weight you have. That's the physical basis of pinning in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Now, we've just given a very clear mechanical understanding of what a pin actually is. A pin is a set of wedges placed around your opponent's hips and head, reinforced by body weight. And now, the million-dollar question you've all bought this video for. How do you get out of pins? If that's what a pin is, how do you beat a pin? The answer I'm about to give you will be one you will use for the rest of your time in jiu-jitsu. It can be said in a single sentence. Your goal, when it's time to get out of a pin, is to get inside your opponent's wedges. He's put wedges around your head and your hips. And your goal is to get inside those wedges. There's a further element. His wedges are reinforced by his body weight. So it helps a lot to first get his body weight moving a little so that the wedges aren't strongly reinforced. So our whole goal when we're in the bottom of a pin is to, 1, start by getting his body weight moving to weaken the reinforcement, and then 2, get inside the wedges. So we start by generating movement, and then second, we work our way inside his wedges. Now understand something. You're not going to be able to get your arms and legs all at once inside all of his wedges. This is going to be a process. You start with one limb, then to another, and you work your way inside incrementally. You don't just get inside the wedges. You come in 1, 2, 3, 4, until you have a significant percentage of your limbs inside his limbs. Understand something about those wedges. Those wedges are his limbs. It's his knees, legs, elbows, shoulders, head. And what I need you to do is first get his body weight moving, and then second, get your own knees, elbows, hips, head inside his. Start with one and build from there. Once you get a majority of your limbs inside a majority of his limbs, you're going to be able to escape every single time. So we've got now the formula for escape. It's incredibly simple. Step number 1, get his body weight moving so that the very thing that reinforces his wedges is being undermined. Then 2, start a process of introducing a first, then a second, then a third part of your limbs inside his limbs until you get to a point where you are positioned inside his wedges in a significant fashion. Once you've done that, it will be easy for you to escape. Every single escape to guard in the sport of jiu-jitsu relies on that simple formula. I say that it's a simple formula, but performing it in a live combat situation, of course, isn't so simple. It will be dependent upon the skill level of your opponent. If your opponent is not very skilled, it's very easy. If your opponent is highly skilled, it's very difficult. And it will remain difficult no matter how good you get at the sport of jiu-jitsu. Because as you increase in skill level, so too will your opponents. And so there's never going to be a day where it's just easy for you to go against the world champion and put him back in guard. However, once you understand this big picture of what you're trying to accomplish with any given escape, you will be amazed at the rapid progress you make with regards getting out of frustrating pins. Let's look at some concrete examples. Let's say Mateus is across my side. Currently, Mateus has a set of wedges around my body. His left arm is wedged underneath my head and shoulders. His head is wedged next to my head. His elbow is wedged close to my hip, and his right knee is wedged close to my right hip. And as a result, I feel movement is very, very difficult for me to accomplish. His wedges are reinforced by his body weight. However, if in a situation like this, I began by generating small amounts of movement in my opponent's body, I feel like I'm starting to undermine the reinforcement of his wedges. And as a result, I'm able to take one of my arms and take the elbow inside Mateus's hip. I've now taken one piece of my body, my elbow, and I've gotten inside one of his wedges, his left hip. Once I've established one, from here, further body movement, I've got his body moving, means now I can attack the wedge on this side. By thrusting with the strength of both of my legs, I can start to move this wedge in place. Now I can take my right knee and bring it as a wedge inside Mateus's knee. So now I have inside position with my right elbow and my right knee. As Mateus goes to hold on to me in these situations and hold his position, look how now I can move my head away from him and take this hand and put it in as a wedge underneath his jawline. When I open my left elbow, I now have opened up space between his chest and my chest. And it's relatively easy for me now to bring my knee in as a pure wedge here on my training partner's hip. One last movement out to the side means I placed them back in the guard, and we've got a successful escape to this pin. You can see the process that was unfolding. I began with small movements that upset my opponent's ability to reinforce his wedges. Then I gained a foothold. That foothold was my elbow going in at my training partner's hip. That was my first instance of inside positioning, where one of my limbs went inside one of my opponent's limbs. Then I built from that position, moving in such a way that incrementally I got one more pieces of the puzzle to fit, one more limb inside his, until there arrived a point where I had more limbs inside his limbs than he had inside mine. At that point, I completed the escape. Let's look again at what's happening here. At this point, early on, you can see that Mateus owns all the inside real estate. His right arm is inside and underneath my left arm. His left shoulder is inside my shoulder. His head is inside my left shoulder. Bring this knee up tight. His hip is inside my elbow, and his right knee is inside my knee and hip. I've got literally none of my limbs inside his. He owns 100% of the inside real estate. And as a result, his body weight easily reinforces the wedges. And if you ask me to escape from this position without making any adjustments in my limb positioning, I'd be here all night and would never get away. I can do whatever I want. I'm never going to get out of this situation because I don't own any inside real estate. However, if I generate movement in a way where I can get first one limb inside, that's my foot in the door. As Mateus goes to reinforce the other wedges to make up for that, from here, I now attack this wedge by shrimping away. For every inch that I move out, my right knee moves in as a wedge. From here, it's a relatively simple thing for me to take my knee through as a wedge in front of his hip. And as we turn, now I have his grip inside my training partner's bicep. At this point, I have almost all the inside real estate. I could use this to either go back to a closed guard or go back to some form of open guard. Now, you see I have 100% of the inside real estate. My hands have the inside position at the bicep, my feet have the inside position at the thighs, and my head has the inside position at the collarbones. We've gone from a situation where I had zero inside real estate to one where I completely dominated the market. And that is the mindset you must be working with. We've got to be able to get our opponent's body weight moving to weaken the reinforcement. And we've got to start an incremental process where we progressively steal more and more of the inside real estate so that my limbs start to get more of my limbs, get inside more of my opponent's limbs. When I reach a situation where I have more inside control, more inside limb positioning than he has, then my escapes become easy. Until then, my escapes feel impossible. The route to escape from pins in the sport of jiu-jitsu is based around moving our opponent's body weight and gaining the majority of the inside control. The game is entirely built up with the effort to get your limbs inside your opponent's limbs. Never lose sight of that basic fact. As long as you're aware of that, you will be able to sustain yourself and fight to get out of the worst pins in time. At some point, we're going to start escaping on a resisting opponent, and that's always the ultimate goal. However, I will say this to you. Until you can master certain movements of your own body, you will never master moving your opponent's body. There are a small set of movements which are absolutely essential for you to master if you're going to call yourself one day a master of escapes. The movements are small in number and all of them are relatively easy to perform, but they are very, very deep in their significance for your development. I'll say this to you again. If you can't master the movement of your own body, you'll never master the movements of another person's body. There are a small core set of body movements which you must absolutely master and become familiar with. I often recommend that you use these as warm-ups before class. Time invested in mastering these simple body movements will be of immeasurable value for your development in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Of all the movements associated with escape in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, there are two which get more attention than all the others. The first is bridging. I'm going to talk to you about the notion of bridging and other closely related body movements involved in escape in Jiu-Jitsu. It's worthwhile spending a considerable amount of time because bridging is one of the absolute most foundational body movements required for excellence in escapes. First, let's clear up some misconceptions about bridging in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Very often, bridging, because it's involved in other athletic activities, gets misunderstood. Remember, bridging is a foundational movement of the human body, and you will see it in many other sports, such as gymnastics. You'll see it in yoga. You'll see it in the sport of wrestling, judo. And in all of those activities, it has a different aim. So, for example, in wrestling, bridging is often used as a means of escaping pins, because if my shoulders can touch the floor in the sport of wrestling, that's often considered a pin, and I should be able to bridge my way out of it. So bridging often has other uses in wrestling too, but it's often used as a means of avoiding a pin. So the whole idea is to clear your shoulders off the mat. In the sport of yoga, not the sport, the activity of yoga, bridging is usually seen as a therapeutic device where it's done for health reasons. And there the idea is to form a complete curvature in your spine. In the sport of gymnastics, bridging is used in a very, very wide array of movements where back arches are required to get hands to the floor. And so the emphasis is on a very, very deep and perfect arch. In the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, the function of bridging is very different. It's to take you from a situation where your chest is facing the ceiling to one where your chest is facing the ground. That's it. That has a very important ramification. It means that the height of your bridge is irrelevant. In fact, the strongest bridges I've ever seen in my career all had a very low bridge. The key to bridging in Jiu-Jitsu is not the height of your bridge, it's the torque that you generate with your bridge. I'll say that again because it's very important. The key to bridging in Jiu-Jitsu is not the height of your bridge. It's the torque that you generate with your bridge. If I bridge straight up and I have an opponent directly on top of me, when I come back down, he's still on top of me. He hasn't moved at all. The idea in bridging in Jiu-Jitsu is to displace my opponent's body weight, not to move them up and down. So the height of my bridge is irrelevant. What counts is the torque I can generate so that I displace them from one side to the other. So the key to bridging is not how far up I go, but rather how much I tilt my opponent's body weight over to the side. And so my bridges will often have this very low characteristic to them, where my hips barely leave the mat. My interest is in generating torque, rotational forces to one side. There's some common problems associated with bridging. The most important problem is the bleed-off problem. If I bridge with my 2 feet flat on the mat, all of my force goes upwards. And as we've seen, that's not effective because when I come back down, my opponent's right back on top of me. If I bridge with my 2 feet flat on the mat and I try to turn to the side, my own left leg gets in my way. And when it's time for me to make a turn to get up on top, look what happens. My energy levels bleed off and you end up flopping. The key to generating strong torque in a bridge in the sport of jiu-jitsu is to transfer forces from one leg to the other leg. It looks like this. I start with my feet asymmetrical. One foot is flat on the ground. That's my first power leg. The initial power of the bridge comes from the foot that's flat on the ground so that I can get my hips off the floor. Then my left foot kicks in. As I turn over, my weight goes onto my left foot and my toes so that I push off the mat, so that as I turn over and my right foot now loses traction with the floor, so it no longer supplies any power, it's my left foot which takes me over. It's the left foot which ensures that none of my power bleeds off and I end up on top of my opponent. Once you understand that bridging is a 2-stage process, it begins with one foot driving your hips up off the mat and then the other foot sustaining the turn so that at all times one of your feet is pushing on the mat. That's when you have a strong rotational bridge that will move people off you. What you can't have is situations where we come up and then from here your feet no longer effectively engage with the mat and you flop over. What we want is to come up and look how as my right foot leaves the mat, my left foot pushes into the mat. So the power is sustained throughout the turn and we end up on top of our training partner. Once again, what we're always trying to avoid is situations where we just go straight up and straight down. And at the same time, we're trying to avoid situations where we push and then our legs give out and the bridge is lost. It collapses. Don't worry about the height of your bridge. Just worry about your ability to come up like so. Then from here, my foot goes down to the mat, so the ball of my foot connects with the mat. My knee angles downwards towards the mat. And now, what was my power leg was my right leg, now shifts to my left. And the left supplies the power as the right leaves the mat. And from here, we end up on top of our opponent. This creates a situation where I started off with my chest facing the ceiling and finished with my chest facing the floor. The definition of a bridge in jiu-jitsu, a bridging escape, is always going to be bound up with that. I start off chest to ceiling. My right leg supplies the initial power that gets my hips off the mat. As my right leg loses power and leaves the mat, the left leg takes over and the left foot pushes and I end up chest down to the floor, hopefully on top of my opponent. This is the mechanical keys to effective bridging in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Bridging in the sport of jiu-jitsu, we saw that ultimately the horsepower behind bridging comes from the transfer of power from one leg to the other. The big problems that most people face is they just power straight up to the ceiling, and as a result their opponent doesn't get displaced. He just goes up and down and you end up in the same situation you were in before. You've generated effort, you've got nothing to show for it. We've seen that in fact I want to start with power output in one leg and then transfer to the other halfway through. Now the next element we need to look at is the idea of positioning your body so that when you bridge, you don't stop yourself. There's nothing more sad in the sport of jiu-jitsu than someone engaging in a movement where they end up fighting their own body. That's the worst feeling of all. Jiu-jitsu is hard enough. Fighting the other guy is tough. Okay, don't fight yourself while you're trying to fight him as well. That's just not desirable. So here's a common thing. Lined up with the camera. When my head is lined up in a position like so, and I start the action of bridging, my own head can stop me from moving. Okay, I want to bridge over my shoulder, and now my head is making contact with the floor, and you'll often see people's bridges fading out as their head becomes an impediment to their own movement. So when we go to bridge in situations like this, a good way to enhance the power of our bridge is by removing your head as an impediment, so you're not fighting against the strength of your own neck as you try to bridge and turn. The way we like to do this is, as we bridge, I imagine a line that comes out of the top of my skull. I want to physically look along that line. The only way I can do this is putting my ear down towards the mat. If my face looks directly up to the ceiling, I fight, my own head fights me as I try to make my rotation and turn. So what I want to do in these situations, I make my legs asymmetrical, as we talked about earlier, and I put my ear on the mat, and I look down the line that comes out of my head. And as a result, no part of my body is fighting against my own hips and legs. This means that when I go to apply my left foot into the mat, there's no impediment for me to fight against. And as a result, we make a very quick and easy turn into the top position. Once again, imagine a line coming out of the top of my head. I don't want to have my own head working against my interests. So our thing is to remove our head as an impediment by bringing my head back like so and looking down that line. As a result, I can push and watch now as my right leg leaves the mat. Okay, I'm going to lose all the power in the right leg. It's no longer in contact with the mat. The left leg takes over. And it's the left leg that sustains the turn. My head is not stopping me. And as a result, we have a strong bridge and we end up in top position. So a desirable looking bridge. Once our hips leave the mat, we go asymmetrical. Look how we turn. And we end up like so. You will know you're performing a bridge well when you do it by yourself by a telltale sign. Let's say I start off facing north, just like so. When I go to complete a bridge successfully, you will end up facing the same direction you started. Okay? When you are performing bridges solo in this fashion, you'll know you're performing the mechanical elements correctly and developing a powerful bridge. Now, a third component of a strong bridge is the ability to walk your way out of a bridge. So often, bridges are seen as an all or nothing affair, where you just explode out from bottom. How many times have you heard that? Explode out of there. The idea is not to explode out, it's to walk out. Once I put my feet into this asymmetrical position, I start my action of bridging. If I just explode, we often get this phenomenon. When I make the transfer from my right foot to my left, everything runs out of power and you end up collapsing on the bridge. And this is exactly what we want to avoid. Okay? So often it's a good idea to walk our way out. Once we start the initial bridging action and we come up, very often I will walk physically to the side to facilitate turning over. That walking action puts me in a mechanically stronger position to complete the bridge. Again, there's nothing sadder than watching someone explode up from bottom and then just collapse right back down where they came from. We're always trying to avoid situations where we come up and collapse. So the idea is, as we transfer from right foot to left, look how from here I walk, and it puts me in a mechanically stronger position to turn up to my knees. This simple expedient of walking to complete the bridge often takes situations where it seemed impossible to bridge out of someone's pin and makes it relatively easy. If there's one movement in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu which is associated with escapes more than any other, it would undoubtedly be the movement often referred to as shrimping. You go into any Jiu-Jitsu class, whether it be beginners or advanced, you will see people sliding up and down the mats in the usual fashion. Like so. And a sad reality is that if you ask people why are you doing that, you will often get confused responses. We always did. I don't know. I guess it helps me escape. And if you ask these people, does doing that every day actually make you better at escapes? The answer, if they were honest, is usually no. It's just a warm-up before class. Let's go deeper into this movement because it is the foundational movement from bottom position in the sport of jiu-jitsu. I'll say this clearly from the start. The single most important body movement for escapes in the sport of jiu-jitsu is shrimping. There's no question about it. And yet, sadly, it's usually relegated to being a warm-up before class rather than a technical skill which you want to develop. If you learn nothing else from this video, learn this. Don't treat shrimping as a warm-up, which you dismiss as something you do before you begin the real training. Study it, learn it, because the more you know about the art of shrimping and how to apply it properly, the easier it's going to be for you to perform all of your defensive and bottom offense movements in the sport of jiu-jitsu. It is literally one of the absolute most important mechanical skills you can ever learn, and your path to mastery of bottom position in jiu-jitsu is mostly bound up with your ability to shrimp adequately under resisting body weight. Okay, so what is shrimping? We've seen most people characterize it as a kind of sliding of the hips along with a jackknifing of the head and upper body up and down the mats. Okay, so it's kind of like most people understand it as a kind of sliding and jackknifing motion where I start lined up like so, my body in a relatively straight line, my legs come out to the side, and from here I slide and my body jackknifes into a bent position like so that I can bring my knee in and then repetitively go out on the other side. This repetitive motion of sliding the hips is often seen in various forms of escape. Okay, now you can do that for years and slide up and down the mats as many times as you want, and then if I put a resisting human being on top of you, you're not going to get out of any pins. That's the sad reality. Performing the moves in this kind of dead fashion doesn't really add up to increased escape ability when you've got a resisting opponent, any more than hitting pads in boxing makes you able to spar adequately when you get in the ring with a good opponent. Let's understand something initially about shrimping. There are two main forms. There are others, but the two main ones that we need to learn at beginner level are sliding shrimps and rising shrimps. Okay, and it turns out that the rising shrimp, which is not seen so often, is actually the more important of the two in most pin situations. Whenever we go to shrimp, the key element is we want to minimize contact with the mat. When we go to slide, there's still a significant part of my surface area of my body on the mat, and as a result we get a rather heavy sliding motion. Okay, that's why people like it as a warm-up, because it's actually physically quite difficult to perform. So what should we be trying to do? Well, first things first, whenever we go to shrimp, we want to be able to take our hips off the floor. Okay, the further my feet from my buttocks, the less efficient my shrimp will be. Similar to bridging. Always remember that the first steps of shrimping, at least a rising shrimp, are remarkably similar to that of a bridge. They're closely related moves. Really, the end of shrimping is different from bridging, but the beginning is almost identical. We bring our feet up and we create asymmetrical feet, just like we did with bridging. I don't have my 2 feet flat. One is flat on the floor and one is turned out. So my feet point at 90 degrees to each other. Now from here, I start a bridging action that puts me up on one shoulder, just like bridging. Okay, my hands are here in front of me, just like so. From this position, my whole intention is to throw my hips out, and most importantly, to invert my knee. My knee wants to point down at the floor. So now the only contact I have with the mat are the two balls of my feet and my left shoulder. Everything else is off the ground. So if I were to go on the other side, you'll see that as my hips leave the ground, only the two balls of my feet and my left shoulder are on the mat. Most importantly, my left knee points down at the floor. Okay? This is the key position we want to get into. When I perform a sliding shrimp, that's just not the case. When I just lazily go down the mat, large amounts of my body weight are still on the mat. My knee is pointing out there in the distance somewhere. We're always looking to come up and create a situation where there's minimal contact with the mat. And as a result, my hips can move very, very actively. My elbow and knee can move very quickly together. And I now have an unweighted foot so that I can pump my knee and elbow together and form effective escapes. When I simply slide along the mat, it's hard for me to get through the nooks and crannies required to get inside position in my limbs to get out of a real pin. So always what we're looking to do is to first move my opponent's body weight. In a sliding shrimp, I'm not moving his body weight first. So if I have a resisting opponent on top of me, pinching his knees in the mounted position, for example, it's very hard for me to move adequately. So the first thing I want to do is move his body weight with a bridge. And then from this position, we slide and invert our knee. From here, we have the two key ingredients to all pin escapes. First, move your opponent's body weight. And second, get inside his wedges. With sliding shrimps, this is very difficult to do because you don't start by moving his body weight. And because your body is not lined up in ways which soon we'll see are favorable to getting inside his limbs, it's hard to complete the move. It is the rising shrimp which constitutes the majority of your escape attempts. So the key element, facing in this direction, is for us to bring our hips off the floor and turn over into this position here. Now we jackknife our body so that my knee is inverted, and the only contact I have with the mat are the two balls of my feet and my left shoulder. This creates a situation where my left leg is unweighted and my right leg and left shoulder bear all the weight. And as a result, I can easily get inside limbs, and from here we can start putting people back in guard. There are times that we do use a sliding shrimp. I'm not saying to you that it's a complete waste of time. There are times when it is not only appropriate, it's a good thing. Okay, so don't think it's a waste of time to go sliding up and down the mat. What I'm saying is you have to go beyond that in the majority of your escapes and start to employ the rising shrimp as your primary understanding of what's needed in terms of body movement to get a resisting human being off you and back in your guard. Now, we've looked at the two most foundational body movements associated with escape in the sport of jiu-jitsu, bridging and shrimping. Okay, but there's many more. And these ones don't get their fair share of attention. They're just as important in their own way. The first one we're going to look at, I often refer to as scissoring. That's a rather strange sounding name, I know, but it'll make sense soon. What's involved here is the scissoring of one leg over the other so that I can go from facing up to the ceiling to facing down. Potentially, this gets me up to my knees and is responsible for many of our most effective escapes from bottom position. So, if I'm here with someone, an imaginary opponent on top of me, if I'm able to shrimp out from this shrimp position, especially when a shrimp fails, what we're going to do is we're going to take our two legs, I have a top leg and a bottom leg, and we're going to scissor our legs over each other. The key element involved is my elbow position. My elbow comes back to my own belt. And as a result, from here, I can scissor my legs one over the other. Because my elbow is so close to me in this situation, it's very, very easy for me to come up to my knees and into a potential escape. Okay? So there's two key elements to scissoring up to our base. One is the idea of elbow position. I'll come back to this very soon because it's extremely important. And the other is the crossing over of my two legs. So I generate a top leg and a bottom leg by shrimping. And then from there we hit the crossover. I cannot hit this move while I'm flat on my back. Why? Because I don't have a top leg and a bottom leg. Our whole thing here is to first create a situation where we generate top leg and bottom leg. Then I put my hips on the ground, the opposite of a shrimp. And a good shrimp, we're always putting our hips off the floor. So now we willingly put our hips on the ground, and from here, my elbow comes back to my own hip. And as a result, it's very easy for me to scissor my legs one over the other. Then from here, we end up in a position where we can put our opponent down. Usually we grab legs. We'll be looking at that later on. There's other ways we can go, but that's certainly one very good one. A key element here is elbow position. Let's do a simple experiment. If I shrimp out to the side and then extend my arm, when it's time for me to scissor, you're going to end up in these very awkward situations where it's very hard to get up. Your ability to get up out of a scissor is always bound up with elbow position. We never want to scissor and get up in situations like this where you get flattened out. Okay. Always our intention is to come up, turn to create the bottom leg and the top leg, and bring the elbow in. Even having your elbow out a few inches can make things hard when you have a heavy resisting opponent on top of you. So always take the extra time to drive the elbow in and the head forward. The further back my head, the more awkward my scissoring becomes. So we always want elbow in, head forward. And now from here, it's the simplest thing in the world to scissor and come up to our base. Okay, so the key elements once again of a successful scissoring movement. First, we've got to create a top leg and a bottom leg. Only way we can really do that is to start with a bridge, like so. Then we put our hip on the floor. As our hip goes on the mat, look how the elbow comes in, the head goes forward. Now one leg scissors over the other, and from here, it's so simple for us to come up and into our various escapes. Once you understand these mechanical aspects of scissoring, you will be able to get up and scissor up to your knees, even underneath very strongly resisting body weight. Now, we're looking at the fundamental body movements involved in escape. The idea is that if you can't master the movements of your own body, you're never going to master the movements of another person's body. One of the key body movements involved in escapes is sitting back into a guard position. Remember, the fundamental feature of jiu-jitsu in terms of escapes is all about putting your legs back between you and your opponent. Sitting back to put your legs in front of you is therefore one of the most important escapes, but it has to be done well. From a situation where I'm underneath my opponent's body weight and he's in front of me or out to my side, I should be able to sit down to a guard position. Now let's imagine his chest is on my back. So it's unrealistic for me to start bringing my head up. His weight would be pushing me down in this situation. So I should be able to sit down to the ground, even with my head pinned down towards the floor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a post leg. So as I get pinned down, I'm going to swisher my legs, just like so. Let's imagine first we have an opponent directly in front of us. I'll look at the side situation shortly. So I start by picking my feet up and swishering my legs. I bring my elbow back to my own knee and I put my foot up on this side. Now from here I pick my foot up off the floor and I pivot underneath my training partner and we go back into the safety of a guard position. The key element is that my head never rises as I perform the move. Why? Because realistically, you're going to have a big man on top of you in this position and you won't be able to get your head up off the floor. He's going to be having his chest on your back. So I should be able to perform the move without my head rising. So from here, I start by swishering my feet, just like so. From the swisher position, I put my foot up. And now my head moves back along the mat. And as a result, I can bring my legs around and catch a hold of my training partner in my guard. If this kind of thing starts happening, if your head rises, you are clearly not doing it correctly. Think about it. If you had a 250-pound man on top of you, could you really just lift him with your head? Of course you couldn't. Okay? If you put your hands out clumsily and sit through like this, that's a disaster. Okay? And you couldn't hope to do that with a 250-pound man on top of your back. What we want is to first create alignment, like so. I put my foot up and then I just curl and pivot. And as a result, I recline backwards without a problem and put them back in guard. So for example, we could combine moves together from a situation where I came up and went scissoring up to my knees and I feel I couldn't put my opponent down. This would be the perfect time to sit back into the safety of guard position. So sitting becomes a very, very important element of escape. If my opponent's directly out to my side, it actually becomes even easier. If I had an opponent out to my left-hand side, I don't even have to shift my feet now. I just take my foot up, it's like so. Everything comes back to myself, and I pivot on my knee and sit back and lock my training partner back in guard. Now we're looking at the fundamental escape movements involved in the sport of jiu-jitsu. We've looked at bridging, we've looked at shrimping, we've looked at scissoring, we looked at sitting. Now let's look at shoulder rolling. From a situation where I have an opponent out to, say, my right hand side, there will be opportunities for us to take our body, open up our knees, and from here put our shoulder down towards the mat. As I open up my knees in these situations, we get a drive leg where I can push and walk my two knees so that my head ends up between my two knees. From this situation, it's very easy for us to bring our legs back in and lock our imaginary training partner back up in guard position. The key element when we go to use these moves is the idea of rolling adequately on the shoulders so that our head positions itself between our two knees. Let's have a look at this again. I have an opponent out to my right hand side. From here, whether I go down on my shoulder like so or like so, doesn't really matter. What does matter is I split my legs and get everything off the floor. Currently, my head is outside my left thigh. It's not until my legs rotate and now my head is directly between my knees that we slowly go forward and put our opponent back in guard. Okay? So once again, let's say we have an opponent out to our right hand side, just like so. From here, I put my shoulder down on the floor. I create a drive leg so I can push off the mat, just like so. Initially, my head is outside of my thigh. But as my legs rotate around from here, we end up in a perfect position to put our training partner back in guard. Key elements. What we can never do is collapse on the roll. So often you see this kind of thing happening. Someone has an imaginary opponent out to their right, and from here they come around and collapse onto their hip. Now the guy's across your side. The key is that as I put my shoulder down, I create a drive leg where I push and my knee comes off the mat. If my knees are on the mat and I try to go around, you will always flop over. So we always want to create a situation where I push and I drive off the floor. Now, I don't stop here. I don't try to roll to guard here. I bring one foot to the other until my head is between my knees. Only when my head is symmetrically placed between my knees do I now go forward and lock my training partner up in guard. This is the basic idea behind shoulder rolling to recover guard position and escape from bad positions. Now, a method of body movement that leads to escape, which never gets much attention but really ought to because it's extremely important, especially at higher levels, is an inverted spin. This is often used in escapes from side positions and especially from north-south positions. From any situation where I have an opponent either out to my side or over my head, I'm going to look to create space with a movement which is essentially a reverse shrimping. Okay, I bring my feet to the mat and I pull my body down the floor like so. And at some point I start creating frames over my head so that I can invert my body and come up like so and catch the floor with my toes. As I catch the floor with my toes, now my bent leg will go underneath the straightened leg. And as a result, I can turn 180 degrees and put someone back in guard. So here, I have an opponent who is over my head. From here, we either bridge into them or reverse shrimp away from them to create space. And then from this position, I come up with a bent knee and a straightened leg. The idea is it's the bent knee that penetrates and it's the straight leg that's going to hook onto my training partner's body. Now from here, the bent knee comes underneath the straightened leg. And from here, we lock up our training partner back in some form of guard. Key elements. I come up and my elbows and knees are very close together, so that between my elbows and my knees there's a strong sense of framing. It's this which enables us to push past our opponent and make a catch. It's my left foot that catches him, and it's my right knee that penetrates to the inside position. Then I turn 180 degrees and put him back in guard. This inverted spin becomes extremely important for elements as disparate as guard retention and escape from certain kinds of overhead pins. The idea that I'm trying to convey to you is your long-term goal is to be able to move other people's body weight. But if you can't move your own body weight efficiently and in the right fashion, you're not going to move anybody else's body weight. So time invested in these critical foundational movements of escape is money in the bank for you. The more time you invest in this solo study in the early parts of your training, the more success you're going to have throughout your jiu-jitsu career. We looked at them as isolated movements, but a very good thing for you to do on a daily basis is just to tie them all together in a kind of loose and spontaneous shadow grappling routine. It always struck me as strange that the greatest boxers of all time engage almost every day in shadow boxing, but it's relatively rare to see grapplers engage in shadow grappling. If shadow boxing is so important for boxing development, why shouldn't shadow grappling be important for grappling development? It's so easy and relaxing to do. It's the best single warm-up you can do before class and has tremendous benefits on your live grappling game. So we might start moving down on the floor, and just as a boxer, when he engages in shadow boxing, doesn't just go through movements, but he actually imagines a rival boxer in front of him and generates movements based on what he sees and visualizes in his imaginary opponent. So too, I want you to envision a rival on top of you in various kinds of pins and your movements involved to get out. So for example, we might have an opponent on top of us and we successfully trap an arm. We engage in a movement which takes us over and gives us top position inside his guard. We switch an imaginary opponent who's now out to our side and is straightening us from side turtle position. So from here we put our shoulder down on the mat, roll through, and put our opponent back in guard. We drop our legs, and from here my opponent is now across my side. So we start a shrimping motion and walk away from our training partner and bring our knee back to put him back in guard position like so. Now from there we imagine an opponent out to our side on the other side. We bring everything in close and we engage in that simple scissoring action so we can come up into a single leg situation. Now we imagine we're caught up in a front headlock, so we put our foot up, and from here we sit back into the safety of guard. From here we imagine an opponent coming around behind us, and from here we roll, go through, and put our opponent back in guard. Now we're mounted, and from here we engage in that shrimping action, which enables us to punch our legs through on one side, and then from here coming up on the other to punch our legs through and put our training partner back in guard. Now imagine him jumping across our side, and from here we scissor our legs, making sure we come up into that same movement pattern we saw. Now he spins around behind me and threatens to go all the way through behind me, and we end up putting him back in guard. And we tie together these various body movements into a kind of shadow grappling routine, which you do spontaneously before or after class, or even just on a day off. I promise you, time invested in these foundational body movements will pay big dividends when it's time to spar with your rivals.